All right, well, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. It is such a blessing to me to be able to be up here and to share with you guys what the Lord has put on my heart this week as I read through the Torah portion. I hope you guys are all blessed. The title of this week's Torah portion is Kedoshim, which means holy ones, and it goes from Leviticus 19:1 to Leviticus 20:27. Now, before I get to the Torah portion this week, I actually wanted to start off in a passage from the New Testament. So if you guys want to read with me, I'm going to start in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 14. And the Apostle Peter here, he is writing to whom? He's writing to Christians, right? Followers of Christ, which is what that word Christian means. In fact, this epistle is one of the few places in the Bible where the word Christian appears. In chapter 4 of this epistle, Peter writes, "If anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name." So, Jews and Gentiles, followers of Messiah, Christians, that is who the Apostle Peter is writing to. And he gives them some instructions. He says in 1 Peter 1, starting in verse 14, he says, "As obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance, but as he who called you is holy, you also in all your conduct, you also be holy in all your conduct, since it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy." Okay, so what is this saying? What are these instructions to us? Basically, what he's saying here is as believers, as Christians, followers of Messiah, we are to be characterized by what? By obedience. He says, as obedient children. And in fact, in the Greek here, that's not just an adjective that modifies the noun. In Greek, it's literally children of obedience. And the idea in the Greek is that obedience is kind of our parent from which we're born, and we derive our identity and our character from obedience. It's the same thing that we see on the opposite side in Ephesians chapter 2 when Paul talks about unbelievers who are children of disobedience. They derive their identity and their character from disobedience. So we as believers, as Christians, we are to be characterized by obedience, and therefore we ought to reject our former ways of disobedience and instead be holy. We are to be holy. Why? Well, the explanation that Peter gives is because he who called us is holy. And then Peter proceeds to quote Scripture. He says, "It is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy." Okay, so Christians are to be holy. But what does that mean? What does it mean to be holy in all our conduct? What does that look like? Are we to join a monastery in the middle of nowhere and meditate all day? Are we to wear funny-looking robes? Are we to learn Gregorian chants? I don't know. What does I feel like for a lot of us, that's what comes to mind when we hear this strange religious word, holy. And that's not a word that we typically use, I don't think, in Western culture. So what is Peter telling us to do? What does this mean that we are to be holy? Well, again, Peter is quoting from the Scriptures here, specifically the Torah, because he says, "It is written, you shall be holy." So if we want to know what Peter means when he calls us to be holy, we have to go back to the Torah to find out what that means, because those were the Scriptures that Peter was quoting from. And this command to be holy, it actually appears a few times in our Torah portion this week. This Torah portion is part of what has come to be called the Holiness Code, which is a section of the Torah dealing primarily with all of these laws governing moral and ethical behavior as well as ritual purity. So if we want to know what it means to follow this commandment from the Apostle Peter to be holy as God is holy, this Torah portion is actually a good place to start. And holy, by the way, is in Hebrew is kadosh. And basically what it means, it doesn't just mean set apart. but it means set apart and dedicated for sacred use. That's the sense of the word and all the related words in Hebrew that we see throughout the Bible. Set apart from common or profane use and dedicated for sacred use. All right, so in this Torah portion, I'm just going to give a quick rundown. We have holiness defined in the following ways. Being holy as God is holy means honoring our parents. It means keeping the Sabbath. What do you give God, by the way? Because we are to be holy as God is holy. We're to love God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength. What can we give God? God created the universe. He already has everything, presumably. Well, if he already has everything, what can we give him? Well, one thing that he doesn't have is us. He doesn't have our time. So one thing that we can give God is our time, and we do that. One practical way we do that is by sanctifying the Sabbath day and keeping that holy, dedicating that day to him. Another way that holiness is defined is by abstaining from idolatry, which is obvious. We're to be set apart from what is common and profane and dedicated to the sacred, holy, dedicated to God. We are to follow all of these proper regulations regarding offerings at the tabernacle. We are to provide for the poor. We're also told that holiness involves being honest. So here's where the ethical kind of nature of what holiness means comes into play. We're not to lie. We're not to steal. We're not to defraud our neighbor. We're not to slander or gossip. We're to uphold justice in court. We're told to honor our elders and care for the disabled in our community, looking out for the vulnerable. So these are just a few laws among many. I didn't even mention all of them. These are a few laws among many others in this Torah portion outlining what holiness looks like. But I want to focus on one particular law in this Torah portion, which I believe serves as the foundation of this call to holiness. And that is in Leviticus 19, verse 18. This is what it says. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Okay, so why do I say that this law is the foundation of all of these other laws governing holiness? Well, because that's what the Messiah says. Our Messiah, Yeshua, according to him, love is the summation of the entire Torah. When he's asked about the greatest commandment in the Torah, what was his answer? He said to love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. He's quoting this law in the Torah portion to love your neighbor. And then he says that all the Torah hangs off of those two laws. So that is to say that true holiness, true Torah observance, according to the Messiah, must be on the basis of love. If it's not based on love, then it's not true holiness. If it's not based on love, then it's not true Torah observance. All of our religiousness, even all of our Torah observance, means nothing if it's not guided by a heart of love. Isn't this what we see all throughout the Bible? The Pharisees, perfect example, they kept many of the commandments in the Torah, did they not? They were very religious. They were very holy, if you will, in their observance of the lighter commandments of the Torah. But according to Yeshua, they neglected the weightier matters of the Torah. Namely, they neglected love in essence. They neglected justice, mercy, and faithfulness. They weren't truly looking out for the vulnerable in their community. They weren't truly honoring their parents, as we see in other places in the Scriptures. So the Pharisees, they had an appearance of holiness. They had an appearance of religiosity in their observance of the lighter commandments of the Torah, but they didn't have a genuine heart of love for their neighbor at the forefront of their Torah observance, and therefore they weren't truly Torah observant. They weren't truly holy the way that the Bible defines it. This is what Yeshua, our Messiah, actually says in Matthew 23, starting in verse 27. He says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanness. So you also appear righteous to others, but within you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Outwardly you appear righteous to others, but within you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness." Interestingly, Yeshua's rebuke of the Pharisees here, it's not unlike what we also see in the prophet Isaiah's rebuke of the Israelites in his day. In both cases, in both rebukes from these prophets of the Lord, the judgment is concerning what? It's concerning religious hypocrisy. This is what Isaiah says in Isaiah chapter 1, starting in verse 13. He says, "Bring no more vain offerings. Incense is an abomination to me. New moon and Sabbath and the calling of convocations, I cannot endure iniquity and solemn assembly. Your new moons and your appointed feast, my soul hates. They have become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them. When you spread out your hands, I will hide my eyes from you. Even though you make many prayers, I will not listen. Your hands are full of blood. Wash yourselves, make yourselves clean. Remove the evil of your deeds from before my eyes. Cease to do evil, learn to do good. Seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, plead the widow's cause." He says he hates the Sabbaths. He hates the feast days. Well, obviously, we know that God doesn't actually hate the Sabbath and the feast days that he commanded us to keep in his own word. As I mentioned earlier, being holy is defined in keeping the Sabbath. Keeping the Sabbath is one of the ways by which we walk out this call of holiness. So what's going on here? Well, God doesn't hate the things that he told us to do in his own word. He doesn't hate the Sabbath or the feast days or these other aspects of what holiness looks like. But he does hate religious hypocrisy. He hates it when people profane his name by having an appearance of godliness, but not seeking justice and righteousness, not loving our neighbor. Being holy, it certainly involves God's standards regarding Sabbaths and what we eat and all of those things. But in order for our lives to reflect true holiness that is pleasing to God and brings him glory, all of what we do must be on the basis of love. So what does it mean to love our neighbor as ourselves? Well, there are laws in this very Torah portion that tell us practically many ways that we can walk that out. Provide for the poor, honor our parents and elders within the community, care for the disabled and the vulnerable within our communities. Don't lie, don't steal, don't defraud, don't slander. These are all ways that we can love our neighbor. But I would submit to you, for an even clearer picture, I would recommend not only reading the Torah portion, but reading the Gospels and observing how our Messiah, Yeshua, lived, because I would submit to you that Yeshua fully embodied the holiness code. Yeshua fully embodied love for your neighbor. He fully embodied the compassion and mercy and justice and righteousness that we ought to emulate and walk out if we hope to be holy as God is holy. And that's all I got. Thank you guys so much. Shabbat shalom.